This lesson is about vocabulary. In this lesson, we're going to talk about lines and angles and how they help us form a foundation for geometry. Let's start with line. A line is an undefined term, but what we say to describe it is a set of points that go on forever, has no width to it, and just keeps going. This is an angle, and what an angle is, if you notice, this is two rays that share a common end point. A ray is where you have an end point, it goes on from there, so you kind of take a line and stop it. That end point is where the ray stops. But if you put two rays together with a common end point, we call that common end point the vertex. So that's a vocabulary term we're going to use quite a bit. Now, if you look at this this angle is the interior of the angle. And around the outside here is the exterior of the angle, which kind of makes sense. In between the two rays, interior, outside the rays is the exterior. Now, let's go back to this line and let's kind of relate the two. First of all, a common term when you want to look at this, we either talk about parallel lines and then we also talk about intersecting lines. Now, let's talk about some of these different forms of these types of lines and how they work together. Let's look at intersecting lines. Intersecting lines, if we draw two lines that intersect like this, we've got quite a few different angles that are formed here. So first of all, what I want to say is that this angle here, if you notice, is right next to this angle there. Those type two angles, if they're next to each other, so angles that are next to each other are called adjacent, which means next to. So two intersecting lines form adjacent angles. Now, we also have here that we've got this angle here and this angle over here are opposite each other. They're not adjacent, they're not next to, but they're opposite each other. We call those vertical angles. Okay, and that means opposite. We use vertical angles quite a bit. All right, now let's go ahead and let's categorize some different types of angles. Okay, let's start with, I'm going to start with over here. If I just draw a line and I pick a vertex here, but that line is straight, that's called a straight angle. That kind of makes sense. Doesn't really, in what we typically say, form an angle, but we're going to call it 180 degrees, forming a straight angle. Now, if we want to categorize some of the other ones, we've got an acute angle, and an acute angle is less than 90 degrees. We've got a right angle, which a right angle equals 90 degrees. Then we've got an obtuse angle, which you're probably familiar with that term. Obtuse is greater than 90 degrees when we measure it. And then this is one that maybe you haven't talked about before. If I take any one of these, so I'm going to take the acute angle here, and if I were to look at the outside of it, so go around here instead of in between the interior, but go to the exterior, that outside of it is called a reflex angle. And that reflex angle is greater than 180 degrees. Okay, so straight angle is 180 degrees, reflex is larger than that. It goes on the outside of the angle. Now, what I want to do is talk about what happens when we put some of these angles together and some of the vocabulary we use with this. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this here. And if I take and I draw a line here and I have two angles together, So these two angles are not only adjacent, and they're also add up to 180 degrees. That's called a linear pair. A linear pair forms a line when you put the two angles together. Now, another thing we do when we talk about these types of angles is we talk about when we have two angles that add up to 180 degrees, we call them supplementary. Supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. Now, they don't have to be a linear pair there. So if I take these two angles and I separate them, so they're no longer adjacent, they're separated, but they still add up to 180 degrees, we call them supplementary, okay? So every linear pair is, those two angles are supplementary, they add up to 180 degrees, but not every supplementary pair of angles are linear pairs because they're not always adjacent. Okay, and then we also talk about when we have a right angle and we have two angles that go together to form a right angle. So I'm going to draw them here separate again. So this one and then this one. If you put these two angles together, they add up to 90 degrees. We call them complementary angles. Those add up to 90 degrees. Okay, so what we have here is we've got a lot of information about angles and lines, talking about what types of angles and lines we have to help formulate our foundations here. So we have a line and an angle. We've talked about the vocabulary like a vertex, different types of angles, intersecting lines, parallel lines, what happens when two angles form a line are called a linear pair, and then what angles add up together. This information will help us formulate some different ideas that will help us build our geometry system.